Grab your beverages and turn up your interweb. Solving the world's problems 12 ounces at a time. It's Dudes and Beer.
Happy Feast Day, St. Augustine, to all you sinners out there, just like me, and my mother. Happy birthday to my mother. Happy birthday to myself. I am officially 43 years old today. One of my buddies came into town. Shout out to Billy Dorsey, Big 43 out there. He came out to sing at the MLK event here in town and asked me to help him produce some tracks. And he came by and he was like, "So what are you doing for your birthday?" It's like, "I'm doing my podcast." I couldn't be happier. I'm having a great guest. I get to hang out with my buddy, and we get to talk about some great stuff. So happy belated birthday to Steven. His birthday was this last Friday. And speaking of birthday people, Julie Connolly, our good friend, had a birthday not too long ago. And I am actually smoking my birthday present from her, a very nice Cuban cigar, as we enjoy this evening with Raul Diego. But before we do that, let's get into the news of the week here. Of course, the news of the week is always available on dudesandbeer.com /news of the week. You can also find it on our Dudes and Beer Facebook group right there /Dudes and Beer. All that good stuff. Some of the news coming out, spacedaily.com told us that a potentially hazardous asteroid is supposed to swing past Earth this week. USA Today tells us that Trump aide says president is weighing regulations on Google search engine that he considers to be rigged. And I put in a funny little post like, seriously, Google's a system that you pay money to rank higher.
Works off of money.
I was like, oh, wait, no, that's fully rigged. CNN was apparently found accused of lying. They had a couple of stories that came out, had horrible background checks on them.
That's not the first time they're accused of.
A GOP retouches a firestorm that claimed the CIA leaked info used to get stories and used for stories to get Pfizer warrants. That's out of Fox News. Of course, there was the news out of Newsweek about Alex Jones and a slip on his browser. And the first sex doll brothel opened up in Toronto. What? That is just some of the news that we have this week.
Oh, my God.
And, speaking of news people, I am so happy to have on tonight Raul Diego. He is a photojournalist as well as editor of the Deep City Chronicles. He's on tonight to talk about his awesome documentary. I've watched it about 4 times in the past 4 days, just trying to get the breadth of it.
Dude, it's really good info, man. I've watched it.
So in depth,
great.
The information that he goes into. So his documentary is Borderline: The Unhinged Truth About the Drug War. You can find it on his website, deepcitychronicles.com. Welcome to the program, Raul Diego. How are you this evening, sir?
Well, how are you guys? Well, first of all, happy birthday. I did not know that it was your birthday. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, most definitely, man. Like I said before the show, whenever I first found you, I was doing a search for news people and ran across Sybil Edmonds, who I, of course, knew from my previous broadcast work, and you were a connection of hers. And I was like, oh, great. Here's a guy working at Sybil's new place, Newsbud. And then I saw Deep City Chronicles pop up a little while back and started following that. And I guess that's right up around the time that we got in touch about you possibly coming on the show was when you put out the first episode of Borderline. And I thought it was great. I was like, I'd love to have you on. And since then you've released part 2 and getting ready for part 3. So tell us a little bit about what got you into photojournalism to begin with. What was kind of your arc in life that led you there?
Well, let's see. I mean, my arc starts when I am a child and reading history at the age of 8. Really getting into things that I shouldn't be getting into. Looking into things I shouldn't be looking into, things like that. I mean, and I've always been a very visual person, which is why I got into the world of advertising and graphic design as a profession, until I decided that I had to follow my passion, which was photojournalism and journalism itself, writing, documentary filmmaking. So, I mean, I can't complain. It's not that I didn't necessarily like my previous incarnation, but all those skills are now serving me well in what I love to do, which is, investigate stories that I find necessary, things that, of course, relate to my own background. Mm-hmm. And borderline is, is something that came up from me knowing a little about Mexico, since I am Mexican and have lived in Mexico, have even been the victim of what they call flash kidnapping.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of those things that if you live in Mexico,
those are uncommon.
You're going to be touched by it one way or another,
right?
Mm-hmm. And in my case, it was that particular modality. But it's a place that if it's kind of funny because as someone who's lived here and there, I understand both cultures inside and out, and they're so different. I often compare it to Mexico is as different from the United States as China is. They're just so two completely different cultures and viewpoints and understandings of the world.
Yeah,
and that's part of the reason why I wanted to do Borderline is, what's going on in Mexico now is a very tragic situation for millions of people, especially people who live in the northern parts of Mexico. They are undergoing really, it's a war zone, and it's much more dangerous than even the Middle East. A lot of places in the Middle East right now. And the reasons for the situation that country is in, the situation is in right now, is much larger than people are given to understand. So I felt like I needed to tell this story, make people see exactly what's going on there now and what the reasons are for those situations.
Well, and I couldn't have said it better myself. The fact that the current situation in Mexico is directly related to the cartels, everything else. It absolutely is. I mean, at the end of part one, right, you talk about the recent assassination of the mayor, all of a month ago.
Right. Taking a selfie.
Right. Taking a selfie with somebody, and somebody shot him in the street.
Bam.
You give a statistic in there, and I want to say it's 300,000 murders.
No, the statistic at that point, which I think it stopped in 2011, I think, or I don't know, but it was 120,000.
Okay,
but it's risen since.
Yeah, and I mean, just that number alone is into many murders a day,
right?
Like within the time frame that you mentioned in the movie. And let's say, what was it that made you break the movie apart in the way that you did? Because part one deals about the Zetas down in Mexico, everything else. Part two deals about the American involvement in this, which is of course what I contacted you about. The fact that most people don't realize we are greatly responsible for many of the cartel woes going on in Mexico.
Well, I mean, it starts with the title, right?
Yeah.
Borderline alludes to like a mental health issue, like borderline personality disorder, or something like that. And of course, the more obvious connotation is the actual physical border line, right?
Sure.
But a lot of people, say that, oh, well, the war on drugs it's just a crazy policy and it's just insanity and this and that. But the truth is that it's not really a crazy policy. It's a strategic form of destabilization that's, it's inherited from earlier historical similar schemes of destabilization, which the United States has imposed on Latin America. This is just the latest version of that. So it's not really crazy. It's actually working. It's been working for decades now.
Well, yeah, and I mean, a lot of people don't realize that, of course, a lot of this kind of policy started long ago. It was really brought to light in the 70s, stuff like that. Whenever Air America came out, things like that. Whenever that information leaked, that we were actively in the process of shipping heroin,
smuggling drugs,
financing weapons for rebels from heroin, things like that. But it goes on way before that. It goes deep into the roots of the founding of America, and we'll get into that whenever we discuss part 2 here in a little while. I want to really get into part 1 and some of the information that you were sharing in that about the prison system in Mexico, as well as the regularly corrupt political system that once that corruption stopped, created the power vacuum that we see today.
Yeah, I mean, it's well, the corruption hasn't stopped. What stopped was a 70-year rule of a one-party system, the PRI. That they were called mockingly, and in some sense admiringly, they were called the perfect dictatorship. Because they had the elections every 6 years, and there was no re-election. The president couldn't serve twice. They had all the trappings of democracy, but there was no actual democracy. There was always the same party, and the president just nominated the next guy and the next guy and the next guy. But within that corrupt system, they controlled everything. They controlled the flow of drugs through the country. They had all the power and all the control, and there weren't really any cartels back in Mexico. There wasn't even violence in the streets. It was pretty much normal every day. But what happens, which I go into that more in detail in part 2, was there was a soft coup, and they basically took that party out of power as a result of some other issues. And when that party was taken out of power, then there was this kind of empty field, and that allowed the drug cartels to form, basically, because before there weren't really drug cartels. They were just like some, gang members who were beholden to the federal government, essentially. But now they've completely overtaken any federal entities, and they are the most powerful bodies in the country.
Yeah, and I mean they fairly well operate with impunity, even to the fact of funding from the U.S. government. There was the whole Fast and Furious scandal that came out all of a few years ago, where weapons were being sold under the table. Like whenever El Chapo was caught, I forget what percentage of his arsenal.
Read those numbers on those guns.
Every single one of his 50 caliber rifles came from Fast and Furious purchases. And it's go ahead. Well, yeah, I touch on that relatively briefly in part 4, actually, and Fast and Furious was just one of several operations, and just a couple of the few hundred or dozen rifles that they confiscated from Fast and Furious. That's nothing. I mean, the type of weaponry that they were sending. We're talking about surface to air missiles. We're talking about some heavy stuff, and we're not talking about just a few guns. Exactly. It was full on arms dealing from the U.S. border across the border.
That's insane.
And people just tend to forget this. They forget the fact that this stuff was in the headlines, and it was in major news whenever it happened. I remember.
Well, because it's all fragmented. That's part of the reason I made this is to kind of combat the fragmentation of information about all this, to make it a cohesive narrative so people can see all the dots together and how they're working.
Right.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about those working cogs, especially in the first part. You sent us an audio clip regarding the prison in Piedras Negras. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Tell us a little bit about pardon my horrible enunciation there. But tell us a little bit about how that was such a working cog in this system before we play that clip and let our listeners hear this awesome stuff from Borderline, the unhinged truth about the drug war.
Well, the Zetas are, they're a one of the many cartels, among the most powerful ones, but not the most powerful ones. But they control most of what is the Mexican northeast, which is kind of like the tip of the states of Veracruz, Coahuila, and that, kind of where Laredo is, Texas, that side of the U.S.-Mexico border. Right. And they essentially took over this prison, this one prison that's located there, called Cerezo Piedras Negras. Mm-hmm. And they were running it as their headquarters for their operations that they were doing across the border there. And it's amazing. And I really, just like I said before, when we talked earlier, I barely touched on maybe 40% of what's detailed in this 70-page report that came out of the Colegio de Mexico, which, the kind of things that were going on there are so absurd. And then added to the fact that the Mexican government itself was still subsidizing the operations of this prison as all this is going on.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, going as far as actively charging the prisoners to be there for their stay. And what I loved was hitting them on late fees. I loved that one.
Dude, you get them in every which way, dude. That's worse than IRS.
And that kind of stuff does actively happen. Like even in our prison system here in America, there's a reason why our prisoners are out fighting the California wildfire. Yeah. That's how they pay for their stay.
It's like $3 for ramen in there, dude.
No, but if you think about it, it's all perfectly logical. I mean, these people, the Zetas, what are they doing? They're just implementing the principles of capitalist.
Oh yeah, it's a damn business
endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, you really can't blame their brilliance,
right?
They're paying off their, they're running the prison and they're making a return so that they can, profit at some point from the operation, and it's just. It's a perfectly logical progression. That's what it is.
Well, yeah, and like you said, it is the most capitalistic of endeavors. And I was telling Steve-O after we saw that, he was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that." Yeah. I was like, "You don't remember the scene in Goodfellas where they go to jail?
Yeah,
and they're talking about how like jail's different for us. Like we own the jail.
Yeah, we own the jail.
Like if you watch the show Narcos, there's the scene where Pablo Escobar goes to prison, and it's like he's got dancers that come and visit, and all kinds of stuff. Like when El Chapo went to jail,
he had the same treatment.
When he went to prison in Mexico. He was pleasantly happy until the day that
women coming in all the time visiting that they would bring
until the day his tunnel was done being dug. He was having a grand old time in prison, El Chapo. And that's just it. This corruption is so inherent there that it's just an ingrained part of the system. Right. And I want to get into that clip here real quick. Hold the line for us as we play this for our listeners. Here is a clip from part 1 of Borderline, the unhinged truth about the drug war.
The federal prison, Centro de Readaptación Social, or Cerezo de Piedras Negras, on the outskirts of the city, was used as a de facto headquarters by the Zetas. The federal prison, Centro de Readaptación Social, or Cerezo de Piedras Negras, on the outskirts of the city, was used as a de facto headquarters by the Zetas. The federal prison, Centro de Readaptación Social, or Cerezo de Piedras Negras, on the outskirts of the city, was used as a de facto headquarters by the Zetas. The shocking details of the activities in the prison were meticulously
Hold the line here. We got
described in
about
a
40 seconds left
73-page
in this
report
clip.
published by the Colegio de Mexico in November 2017. The penitentiary, which stood on 12 acres of land, had a total of 655 inmates and 77 government-paid employees in 2011. They were all under the jurisdiction of the cartel-appointed Jefe de Plaza, David Loreto Mejorado, a.k.a. El Comandante Enano. The prison was also a source of revenue for the Zetas, who devised multiple schemes to not only cover their expenses, but turn a profit as well.
And my favorite part is how the Zetas actually managed to turn a profit with the running of the prison itself. It wasn't even off the drugs or anything else. They actively made it to where the prison itself was a moneymaker for the gang.
Yeah, I mean, they were running a business, from top to bottom. They were using the prison. Later on in part one, you learn how they were, bringing in automobiles to retrofit them for, to hold the drugs that they would then just, roll into.
Put those compartments in there.
Yeah.
Right. And all that body work was being done at the prison by the prisoners.
Yeah.
And then it just gets worse from there. You bring in, victims, people to be killed or already dead to, be incinerated there, and all kinds of, ridiculous.
Yeah, horrifying things going on. And, that's just one of the ways that that the gangs have been able to amass power and become cartels there, is through that system. And I remember when I was a kid, my dad did quite a bit of work down on the southern border, stuff like that. And would go across frequently, and it was one of those, like, it was a regular thing that you could pay a police officer. And all of it, even when I was in college, I would go across the border in Brownsville, things like that on the regs. I'd go down and hang out with my buddies from college.
You bought that Spider-Man comic book cheap, huh?
All kinds of stuff. And all of a couple years ago, I was doing the Texas School Bus Drivers Convention down in Brownsville, and McAllen rather. And I had a good friend of mine who lives there. I was like, yeah, man, let's get together. He was like, what do you want to do? Like, you got tomorrow off? I was like, yeah, let's go to Mexico. And he was like,
nice.
No. We don't go to Mexico anymore. We don't. And that was like a regular thing. Like, we went to Mexico every day.
Was
it was like going to the corner store.
After Matamoros?
Oh, this was way after Matamoros. This was a good 5-6 years after that.
That's true.
But even now, to go down there and see the environment, to feel the vibration going on in towns like Brownsville, McAllen, even Laredo, right across the border from Nuevo Laredo. Like, man, they find headless bodies in Nuevo Laredo on the regs,
like nothing.
I mean, I was living in Acapulco, and now Acapulco is not anywhere near the border. Acapulco is next to the Pacific Ocean down south,
other side of Mexico.
Right. But and that's where I was kidnapped.
Oh, wow.
The thing is that place, everybody hears Acapulco, they think of, like,
it's beautiful.
Tarzan in the 50s, like all these stars, people going there, like it's like Hollywood. Yeah. But not even close. I mean, that place is just as bad as any border town. And when I left, which was years ago, within 2 weeks before I left, I remember that there was this news that there were six decapitated heads of policemen that had been left at the steps of the police precinct. Yeah. And under one of the heads, they had left a list of the next 25 cops they were going to kill.
I think I remembered his story, actually. I remember hearing this.
Just hearing that, I was just telling Steve, like, I would love to go back to Cancun and Cozumel. I wouldn't pay like $200 round trip for a ticket to a resort there right now. You couldn't probably pay me to go to one of my favorite places in the world. You know, and that's really crazy to think, because I've been married all of 5 years coming up in October, and that's where we spent our honeymoon, and it was great. And we went and walked the market the way I did when I was a kid, all kinds of stuff. And to know that now there are travel advisories, and like you said, they found the decapitated bodies. They just found 8 decapitated bodies in Cancun.
Yeah.
You know, and it's one of those people, the same way you were saying about Acapulco, how people have this idyllic concept of it. It's the same way with Jamaica. Mm-hmm. It's the same way with Cuba.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, like I said, my friend just went and took a trip to Cuba, and she was like,
point of view,
she was like, number one, it was really strange to only be able to get so much money.
Well, I mean, as far as Cuba, I know that whole story too, because my father's Cuban. I live in Miami, and I know the whole Cuban thing. Yeah, that's a whole different story.
Oh yeah, but I mean, the way that these governments are toppled, the way that these regimes rise to power, is fairly well a wash, rinse, repeat process.
Dirty money,
and that's kind of what we're getting at, and exactly what you got at in part one, and went further into in part two. Part one of Borderline, like I said, was very much about the destruction of Mexico itself, the way that you introduced the fact that its economy later became crumbled. And I would like to get into that a little bit now that we're kind of getting into some of part two here. Exactly what was it that started? Because I remember in 82, when the Mexican president gave his speech, I was about 7 years old.
Oh, yeah, you remember that far back?
I don't remember that, but I do remember being a young teenager and being able to go with my dad, down to Del Rio, things like that.
Nice.
And cross the border and get things crazy cheap, everything else.
Get that chicle.
And it was one of those, like, the dollar was so overpowering to the peso. The peso was so devalued at that point.
Right.
What was it that led up to the crash of the Mexican economy and to the state that it is today?
Well, I mean, that's really one of the most important parts of the story as far as Mexico is concerned, because when you have I didn't really get into this part in the series, but before we're talking about Mexico in the 50s and the 60s, you're talking about an economy that's really on the rise. Mm-hmm. Things are going very well. Oil is basically underpinning the whole growth. But at the same time, people are becoming more educated. There's more spending power. Basically, the Mexican economy was growing slowly but steady. And then, I don't know if you're familiar with, I suppose you're familiar with John Perkins and his book, Economic Hitman, or the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Yeah. And that's essentially what they did in Mexico, as they did in all other Latin American countries, in an effort to break any protectionist tendencies in the economy, and trying to get American corporations to do anything they wanted in these countries. With Mexico, the thing about Mexico is that the United States has two problems with Mexico. They can't be overtly aggressive with Mexico because they're a border country. Yeah. They're neighbors. So politically, it's impossible for the United States to A, invade Mexico, B, appear to be
combative in any way. Yeah.
Combative. Right. It's not a good look for them.
Well, it doesn't behoove either country to not be friends.
Right. It's part of the whole show. They have to maintain that identity. So in the late 70s and 80s, early 80s, they essentially approached Mexico. And when I say they, I'm talking about, these these shadowy teams of economic hitmen, these groups of
investment
engineers
bankers
and economists. Right.
Yeah.
They always approach these these very corruptible governments in our countries, Latin American countries. And they basically, with Mexico, they basically said, well, look, you have all this oil, and we just, we did assessments and we found even more oil. And you have now the ability to borrow till you drop, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? And they always take the bait because these guys that run these countries are just as bad as anybody else.
Oh, yeah.
And they're looking out for themselves and their buddies and what have you. And they basically made Mexico, they offered Mexico these huge, what was back then huge amounts of money. Right now, back then it was 12-point-some billion, which, now seems like nothing.
That's nothing. That's one line item.
Right. Today. Back then it was, a lot.
Yeah.
It was like trillions today.
Yeah, that's toilets for the space station, $12 billion. That's
right, exactly.
Dang.
But essentially it was the same formula. Once they signed the loans with the World Bank, what they do is that they cut back on the projections, and they say, well, look, turns out you didn't have as much oil as we thought. So guess what? You still owe us all the money.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you still borrowed the money.
Yeah.
So
right.
You signed a deal with the devil.
Yeah.
So now we're going to come in and cut your education and your social services. The famous structural adjustment programs.
Dang.
Which is interesting that they choose markets like oil, things like that, instead of something that Mexico has been known for generations, which is they're one of the largest silver deposits in the world.
Exactly.
But that's such more a qualitative aspect than oil prospecting.
Maybe chocolate. Chocolate's good.
Well, yeah, but it's really about those hard resources, and oil is one of those, like, you can have much more of a speculative market with oil as far as what you expect to produce.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, but the point is not to make it happen. The point is to get them in debt.
Exactly.
That's the whole idea.
Once you got somebody in debt, then they're like indebted to you, like an indentured servant. And they're taking advantage of the country, the people, and now they're devastated with that damn deal that they made with the World Bank.
Well, and it's interesting that's one of the reasons why countries are trying to leave the EU. Things like that is because it's basically just become a huge circular revolving door of debt.
Somebody finally woke up.
Right, but this is none of this is new, and they reinvent the whole scheme every so often. The war on drugs is just a new scheme in an old game.
That's just it. It's just a new hood to pull over the eyes. And at this point, I want to kind of get into the history of this scheme because that's really what part 2 focuses on a lot is not just the history of this scheme and how governments and how people within countries are broken by the drug trade, but how the U.S. has been integral in this drug trade worldwide since our founding. Let's get into that a little bit, as well as the connection to Skull and Bones and other societies like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, people don't necessarily realize how intertwined the beginning of the United States is with drug trafficking. Essentially, and it's really an offshoot of human trafficking, which is what slavery was, essentially. So you have slavery, you have drug trafficking, you have all these sorts of nefarious activities that everybody was engaged in and they made fortunes off of and basically built the foundations of the entire country.
Yeah.
And since there was no actual country, really, all these people were just engaging in these activities, and then the country kind of formed around it. And so everything became, officialized. and they started making the schools and the libraries and off of these drug trade trafficking profits.
Yeah, philanthropic endeavors with their ill-gotten gains.
Right, and it's not even limited to even just opium, as I talk about in part 2.
Right.
But one of the biggest ones, which isn't considered officially a drug, but which is a huge part of the foundation of America, is tobacco.
Yeah.
Tobacco farming, which they sold all through Europe. That's also huge, even bigger than opium.
Yep.
That's also, a drug in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Like I said, I watched your documentary at least a good 3 or 4 times since we spoke last week. And I know I'd seen part 1 whenever it was released. But to go through and watch it and really get in depth and start to see this connection, things that I'd heard before, things that I'd seen before. I recently made a trip to Boston, and it was interesting. My wife's family is from up there. I spent some time up that way for quite a while. And just to see the fact that everything there is changing because of racist history, Faneuil Hall, Yawkey Way, all that kind of stuff. Why is it that we don't see? And granted, in Borderline, you put out the letter from the first Boston Public Library that was, of course, built by the brothers that dealt drugs, and they were like, "Yes, we understand it was built by ill-gotten gains."
Exactly.
The depths to which these connections go is really phenomenal and really amazing. And like you said, something that has really been an ongoing political campaign for quite a while, a means for us to economically get rid of political foes, for us to use our means to put candidates into office, things like that. I'd like to get a little bit into Zapata Oil, some of the front companies
I was going to say fronts
that were used to take care of these means, especially in the days of the Iran-Contra affair, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're talking about Zapata Oil is just one of the many companies that George Bush was a part of, which were all unprofitable. He never made any money on any of them because
all on paper
matter.
failures.
Right. It was all about making the right connections to the right people and networks. Mainly south of the border, but also in China. I mean, Bush was the guy, the point man in the opening of China. He was the ambassador. He was Nixon's ambassador to China. Back after he was a CIA director, he was in China, doing his things.
Oh, dang! I didn't realize that. That's messed up.
And but that also ties back to what eventually happens in Mexico. Bush happens to be present in both Mexico and in China. Both of those countries, kind of play off each other. When Mexico's economy goes down the drain, all the jobs that were in Mexico with all these maquiladoras that they called.
Yep.
These industrial factories in northern Mexico, they all eventually shift their production to China. In the same decade. That's really what it pulled the bottom out of the Mexican economy was that.
Yeah.
Because now all of a sudden, there's the drugs are coming in, the jobs are leaving, the peso is still unable to recover, and it's just a disaster. And the government, the PRI is gone. So now there's a vacuum of power. It's all this like a perfect storm, but it's a perfect engineered storm is what it was.
Yeah. Disaster by design, absolutely. By economic design.
Yeah.
And it's really part, it goes back to the underpinnings of what's called the Monroe Doctrine, which is, the idea that the United States must maintain hegemony in Latin America. It must be the dominant force. And so all these things, the war on drugs included, and everything that came before and everything that's going to come after it, these are all just different manifestations of the push for dominance by the United States in Latin America.
Absolutely. And right now we've actually had one of our listeners, Dean Larinaga, who chimes in frequently, chime in via chat saying, let's not forget that, of course, they took money from Russia and the Nazis as well. Chocolate, as Steve-O was saying as well, is South America and has its roots down there, a controlled market.
I'm just saying those Aztecs and Mayans are going really, that was gold back in the day.
Most
Chocolate.
Definitely. And became a huge delicacy in Europe after Columbus came back and became a wildly controlled market. But he also mentioned that nobody talks about Spain using slaves and native islanders to win Florida and Louisiana from other natives. And of course, these are all things that we know about history. They're all stuff that brings greater things to light, because whenever you're talking about countries, of course, using slaves and then that market goes away, like you said in the documentary, these brothers, these people used their knowledge of the slave trade and the ships that they used in that and basically just converted them for drug smuggling. They turned them into Millennium Falcons of the sea and just made huge smuggling compartments underneath where they used to hold people.
Yeah, that's messed up, dude. But that's true.
Yeah, it's just one commodity for another.
Yeah, and I've made the analogy many times over the last year of the fact that the migrant worker situation going on in America right now is very much a modern day slave trade. Where people come across, they work for easily what is a good third to a quarter of minimum wage. And the proof is in the pudding right now with all the crackdown going on the border. There's literally produce that's rotting out in fields in California that cannot be harvested because people will not come take the job. They raised the rate to above minimum wage. And people will not come out and take the job.
Jeez, that's messed up, dude.
And that's literally the point that we've put ourselves in as a country,
right,
is the fact that we willingly still use slave labor all the time.
Well, the United States has been Mexicans have been crossing over to work in American fields for decades,
Technically, they were their fields first, but...
Well, not those kinds of fields.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
The industrial farming operations, World War II, that's when they started bringing, it was called the Bracero program.
Yeah.
They started bringing, Mexicans to work in the fields. However... What's the more recent issue with that really is what happens with NAFTA. NAFTA, what it did to the Mexican farmer, the small Mexican farmer, essentially it destroyed the Mexican farmer because, there are all sorts of stipulations as to what the produce needs to look like and weigh and the color of the tomatoes, all stuff that is only possible through industrial agricultural techniques, which are unavailable.
Yeah, fruit waxing, things like that.
Right. So a lot of these guys had to leave their plots, plots that they own, to come to the United States to pick tomatoes in some, huge commercial operation. And now, let's see, what's happening now is that now they're reconfiguring the whole trade regime because people are leaving the first, this is what I deal with a lot in part 3 is the trade regime and how that plays into the whole drug war. What Trump is doing now, they put Trump in office so he could reconfigure the whole trade regime because people are just dropping from the trade regime. Yeah. Australia doesn't want to be part of anything. The whole continent of Africa is like, I don't want another trade deal. Everybody's like, I don't want it. I don't want your free trade,
Yeah.
And so Trump is there to be like, oh, okay, let's renegotiate everything.
Well, and granted, there are some things going on with that. Like I said earlier, it's interesting to me how right now I'd like to get a little bit into NAFTA because you brought it up. Like I was saying before the show, NAFTA is one of the first real political things that I remember coming onto my radar whenever it came across, and I distinctly remember.
Did Bill Clinton pass that?
That's where it first hit. But the two things I remember coming about were, number one, the North American Free Trade Highway. The fact that there was to be an unchecked freeway for the transportation of goods from Mexico to Canada.
I remember that being at the beginning of this.
Going straight through Texas.
Right.
And that was really like the beginning of the landslide. Attached to that was the fact that there was the concept of the Amero. It was right after the Euro had passed and right after the European Union, and we were looking at the North American Union,
right? Yeah,
Mexico, United States, and Canada, and they proposed the Amero, which was a unified currency between the three countries,
right?
And those were the two things that popped up on my radar, even as a 20-something,
right?
Whenever it happened, that were like, wait, what?
Yeah, it was amazing.
Hold on a second. And that was really when the state of Texas became active, because it was like midnight hour that this information came out and was verified.
Always.
People, of course, it was all over Coast to Coast AM, things like that. Those news outlets that this stuff was in there, but most of the mainstream media were not focusing on these things. Even the CNN clip about the Amero was something that was so off the radar that very few people saw it. And I remember when I heard about the North American Free Trade Highway, I was like, my God, that's one of the most horrifying things I've ever heard. You're talking about cargo going unchecked across borders. Like that's drug smuggling, that's human smuggling, that's all kinds of stuff. And I was in my 20s, like easily 20 or 21 when that was going through. And the fact that now, like I said before the show, they're talking about a new NAFTA. It just went through.
Right. True. Yeah.
They're talking about. Go ahead. Go ahead.
This is what I mean. The whole Amero thing to me was kind of a lark because, practically speaking, there was no way that could possibly happen just because of the disparity and the value of the currencies.
Well, not just that, but I really think the disparity in the governments of the countries.
Well, I mean, all of it together was just it was kind of like but as far as like unchecked cargo goes, I mean, you have to realize, I mean, the people I deal with in part one, the Zetas, they're not the big boys. Those guys are kind of, even though they make billions, they're still small time.
Yeah.
The most powerful cartel in Mexico is the Sinaloa cartel.
Yeah.
Okay. And those guys, the Zetas are sending cars through the border, right? To the ground. But the Sinaloa cartel is using Mexico City International Airport. Yeah. You understand? They're flying planes into the airports. They're not worried about tunnels in
they aren't worried about they aren't worried about tunnels being found in a KFC in Arizona.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, right. KFC in Arizona.
That was the latest
that was
news.
True. That was a real article recently this week.
But that's the truth. They're filling jumbo jets in Mexico City and flying them here. So it's not like.
And that's a big part of it, and a lot of people don't realize. Like I said, it's the prestidigitation of it. It's the fact of let's use one to be the small potatoes and the distraction that we catch all the time.
Right.
But let me tell you, I mean, all of this is fine and dandy. It's kind of working out for the people who are designing this, but these are the kinds of things that eventually spiral out of control.
Oh yeah.
And it's happening already in Mexico. There's a town in the southern state of Michoacan. I forget the name of the town right now, but Michoacan is another one of those very hot places. And this town basically they just decided to put their foot down one day, and they kicked out the police. They kicked out the politicians. They kicked out everybody, and they're now basically patrolling their own town.
Yep.
There aren't any. There's no government. There's no drug cartels. There's nothing.
Yeah, they were one of the town. They were the town that a few years ago was like, please come by and get a gun. Like they were literally giving guns away to people to be able to protect themselves and stuff like that. They were one of the first states in Mexico to be like, forget that federal rule about no guns.
Right.
This is the only way people can protect themselves from the evil at hand.
Right.
So we will gladly arm the people to take our city back.
Right.
Yeah, and that kind of thing eventually is going to spread.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that opens a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
That's a whole different.
Yep.
Yeah. It
can only push the people so far, and they take their own shit back.
Yeah. And, just looking at that and looking at the fact that I try to share stories on the Dudes and Beer group all the time about it. And like I said before the show, a lot of my starting this show was the burden of knowledge, knowing these things and seeing people who were so blinded by the quote unquote facts, that they were missing the stuff that was actual facts, things that had been declassified, programs that had come out. It's funny to me how much we still to this day and how much media relies on the CIA, when never once when taken to task before Congress have they ever told the truth.
Right.
Never once.
Right.
Yet still, for some reason, we're willing to believe whatever comes out of their mouth.
Yep.
Well, I mean, frankly, what I see as far as like from a kind of a macro perspective in terms of all that is that when 9/11 happened, when they realized that they could sell the story that they sold to the American people, at that point they decided, well, we can sell them this, we can sell them anything. And at that point, everything started going downhill. Like everybody started, I actually left in 2001 because I could not stand. Like I was like, really? You're gonna go down this road? Like you're gonna believe this
tripe
pastiche, whatever the hell you're trying to sell here?
And it really is the fact of that stuff is nothing but a facade that's put up, and when you willfully ignore the laws of physics to believe a story, that's it. It's game over. I can sell you anything I want now. It's like you'll believe anything. Yeah. And that's just it. Dean Larinaga just popped in saying these same countries sell their own people and support these drug cartels, and to an extent, so it's major corruption. At the same time, they will send families here and with visa lottery programs to get education or take advantage of the school programs, then force them into slavery inside of our country. Like we said earlier, that's absolutely true. We bring people in for that all the time. And there have been so many, as I put it on this show, Raul, litmus tests, things like 9/11, things like the Boston bombing, where it's literally like, okay, this just happened. What is the tolerant level?
Yeah.
What becomes the new norm? And the prime example of that in our country right now is actively San Francisco. And I've made this point on our show frequently. The mayor of San Francisco has recently come out and said there is more human excrement on the streets of San Francisco than I've ever seen in my life. It's worse than I've ever seen in my life. And it's like, okay, that statement alone means at some point seeing human excrement became normalized to you.
Right. It's just now there's more of it.
It's more that it's more than you've ever seen.
Yeah.
And if that's not a statement for what's going on in our government and our country, all over the place with our foreign policies that put these things into action as far as economically crushing neighbors like Mexico for economic benefit of the drug dollar.
For benefit.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not even. The thing about it is that it's not even about the drugs. It's not even about profiting from the drugs itself. It goes much deeper, because what we're really talking about is keeping countries in complete ignorance. See what people don't understand. Like, as someone who's seen both sides of the game, like people in Mexico and people in Central America and the rest of Latin America, they don't understand what's happening to them.
Yeah.
They don't understand that, their education level is so beneath the levels that it should be because of decades of manipulation of their education system. And, the IMF coming in to take the money away from those programs. So people don't know how ignorant they really are.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because as someone who comes from a family of teachers, I have brought that up on this show numerous times, that look at what's going on in our country. If it's the fact that, we could get a federal education czar out of there, quit controlling what it is that's happening with education federally, you'd be surprised what happens. And that ignorance campaign, that steady campaign of keeping people ignorant, even the fact that over 7 decades, the PRI was in control. That in and of itself relegates who's getting funding for education. What kind of education is being funded? Everything. So you're talking about a planned obsolescence of education for 70 years.
Right.
You're talking about two generations of corrupted voters.
That's throughout the continent. It's not just Mexico. And that's not.
That's
worldwide, really.
That is.
World.
Absolutely.
What you call the third world is basically just, countries that have been purposely targeted to keep the populations at a low level of education.
Yeah.
It's no accident that the Perkins brothers, these Boston guys, it's no accident that they were giving money to build these libraries and stores of knowledge, because that was really the crux of the war. The idea is to keep the knowledge here.
The winners control the truth.
Exactly. The truth and the knowledge and the know-how and the techniques and everything. The internet is all in English, basically. Like the real information is in English.
Yeah, you got to translate it to get it in another language.
Right. So there's just even just that, and people in Mexico and other places that don't have English as their first language, they're really behind the curve. And they don't even know that they're behind the curve.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it is, as you say, it's generations.
And that's just it. Like we even in this country have gotten to the point. I remember all of about a year or so ago, I went up to Boston, and one of my nephews up there was having not really some troubles in school, but being a little disheartened about the school system. He's in like 9th grade. That's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I had to explain to him, listen. And this is how I've come to explain it to most teenagers: listen here. There are some facts in life that really suck, and they're horrible. And the fact is, most jobs do not require anything more than for you to wash, rinse, repeat the same process day in, day out.
That's very true.
To regurgitate the same information on the same form in your cubicle all day long. Mm-hmm. Stuff like that.
Right.
That is what our education system is preparing you for.
Mm-hmm.
It is preparing you for
that monotonous,
the menial, monotonous job of assembly, which unfortunately we've gotten to the point where we've told people assembly isn't a good thing. Where like you could at least have a trade, you could at least have a guaranteed job if you assembled stuff. But in addition to this subtraction of these trades from schools, we've also set up the fact of if you don't go to college, you're not worth anything.
Well, I mean, the education, the United States has now passed into a different era. You know, it's no longer what it used to be in terms of it used to be the center of innovation. It used to be, those trades were actually valuable.
Oh, absolutely.
Today, you have computers and robotics. Forget it. It's over. There's no more assembly.
We don't even need you.
Well,
exactly.
Even that though is the fact of like I compare myself all the time to George Jetson. I do corporate AV. If you remember George Jetson's job,
one button.
Rudy did all the work. Mm-hmm. The computer did all the work. Mm-hmm. George's job was to fix Rudy whenever he jammed up.
Fix Rudy when he jammed up.
Like I'm a corporate AV tech. Most of the time, the executive is running his own PowerPoint. He's doing his own thing. I'm there to hit the button in case there's an emergency, and I happen to know how to fix the machine if something goes horribly awry. I'm George Jetson.
Right, but now George Jetson has a problem.
Or Homer. Wasn't Homer at the damn nuclear facility hitting one button?
One button. One button.
Yeah, the big problem is that there's 7 billion people on this planet. So, then there can only be, a few Georges, manning the controls.
Yeah.
So you have this major situation that's coming up.
Yeah.
A major social breakdown that's going to happen no matter what.
Well,
and the problem is really what, they're going to try to manage this crisis to their benefit. And it's coming and they know it's coming. The people who don't know it's coming are the people who are like going to be majorly affected.
Yeah.
Which is all these ignorant people around the world who have zero education.
Well, and they know it's coming because, of course, it's coming by design. Much like the crash of Greece, that was just an echo of what happened to Mexico, what happened to Chile, what happened to, good God, Venezuela.
Right.
Yep.
Look at what happened to all of these governments that we have, in all actuality, been integrally tied to.
Exactly.
Venezuela, until they became socialist and everything, was one of our biggest oil partners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing that happened in Venezuela is this. See, there was a tiff between the left and the right in Venezuela back in the late 80s, and the right decided that they wanted to put a puppet in power. And the guy they chose to be the puppet was a guy named Hugo Chavez. Mm-hmm. But Hugo Chavez, they lost control of Mr. Chavez.
Yeah.
And they had to put him down like a dog, which is what they did eventually.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And by they,
Well, by they I mean the right wing faction in Venezuela who
the powers that be.
And other connected powers.
Yeah.
Right. And Maduro's not Chavez
of that area.
Heir. Maduro is intimately tied to the power structure.
Yeah.
He's carrying out the designs for these people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's just it's interesting to me how, like I said earlier, how wash, rinse, repeat this system is. How easily they have it down to be able to bait and switch countries who have this eminently corruptible government, who have people in power like you were saying with Mexico, where it's basically a purchased government.
Right.
It's been there in place and in state for that long, and even whenever the change happens, being able to take advantage of that still takes place.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also it goes back to the education. Once a generation passes,
I agree.
the following generation still doesn't know what happened.
Yeah.
There's nothing is passed on, so they fall for the same tricks.
It's almost like an erase of history when nobody remembers, and then they're able to repeat.
It's what they do here. Yeah, it's what they do here in a micro level. It's kind of when they bring back the styles, like they have the 80s are back. So everybody who lived in the 80s will get nostalgic, and they buy all the shit from the 80s again.
Yeah.
And they do it, they'll do it for the 90s, and they'll do it for the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
They do it every so often.
Yep.
Yeah. And I'd like to actually play the clip from the beginning of part 2, discussing the history of Boston and its drug dealing roots, things like that, and kind of springboard off that here. So let's go ahead and play this. This is from the beginning of part 2 of Borderline, the unhinged truth about the drug war.
Few people walking the streets of Boston, Massachusetts today realize that their city and many of its most illustrious institutions were built by drug traffickers. Prominent Boston family names like the Cabots, Cushings, Delanos, and Forbes all trace their lineage to the vast fortunes made on the backs of Chinese opium addicts. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1628 by the trading company of the same name and led by zealous Puritan lawyers. It was a commercial enterprise from the start, and foundational mythologies notwithstanding, the city's links to the British Crown were never truly severed.
And I'd like to talk about that for a second, about the fact that the links to the British Crown were never quite severed.
Yeah.
Because that's something that so many people don't know. The fact that there was still a contingent that was loyal to the Crown, that was still a contingent that was using new grounds explored by the Crown and being conquered by the Crown as a means by which to go sell drugs and collect money to come back here to the United States.
Yeah, I mean that's really, in my opinion, that's just the superficial manifestation of what really is the whole nation-state system. Which is basically the legal construct that is used for this, new world order that we live in today. The whole nation state, which is a legal entity. The whole justice system is part of that British Crown entity that's still holds the Anglo-American world together. The drug trade was, the British were doing the same things as these American companies were doing. They were all doing it together in Asia. They were even competing amongst each other. And that's just, it was part of it's part of the same thing. It's the same thing as going on today. It was so-called free trade, let me do whatever I want in your country.
Yeah.
Essentially,
Yeah, and that goes directly into the case of Dan Seal. Ooh,
Barry Seal,
or Barry Seal. Yeah, sorry, Barry Seal and George W. Bush, things like that. Back in the late days of Iran-Contra, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a straight line. It's Skull and Bones was founded by those same people who were trafficking opium in China, and Skull and Bones is the recruiting arm for the, one of the recruiting arms, one of the highest position recruiting arms of the establishment.
Well,
and of course,
explain that for us, because so many people, number one, understand nothing but a small myth about Skull and Bones. They don't understand
Right.
its connection to U.S. politics. They don't understand its connection to U.S. banking, things like that. So kind of integrate that web for us a little bit.
Well, I mean, like I said, the opium traders were the ones who, founded or generated the funds for the building of schools like Princeton and all these, the Eastern establishment was basically all drug money.
Yale
and Yale, Harvard, all these guys, and Skull and Bones is probably the most important one of these so-called secret societies that were basically just, it's a type of fraternity for the elite, where they pick and choose like who's going to, who are we going to pass on the secrets of power, essentially. So they would pick and choose from the families, their, interbred Boston Brahmin families and, the area. And they would bring them in, you have families like the Delanos of, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You have the Forbes family, a famous Forbes magazine.
Yep.
You have John Kerry, who is part of the another opium trading family. And all these people, they go back generations, and they all, come down the pike in the Skull and Bones selection process. They all eventually form part of this secret cabal, which, for some reason, some mysterious reason, they all eventually end up in government, very high up government positions or finance or something. Presidents, of course, we've had at least 3 or 4 presidents from Skull and Bones.
Yep.
And George Bush is, as far as our story is concerned, as far as the drug war, he's one of the most important figures in this whole story.
Explain that to us a little bit.
Well, he was the one. Well, I don't want to explain too much because I really go into it in part 3, like the details of how George Bush actively and in tandem with the governments and the corporations, they basically built this pincer movement, which on one side you have the war on drugs, on the other side you have so-called free trade, the trade regime. And it's through those two arms that George Bush kind of manages the Anglo-imperialist movements throughout the world during his tenure, which basically extends from the 70s to the end of the century. It's like a good 30 years that he's basically at the helm, or very close to the helm, of power in this country.
At the very least, entrenched.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least, but certainly, when he comes in with Reagan, he is the president of the United States. Reagan is an actor. That's what he is.
That's kind of what I kind of figured.
Yeah, he is definitely the background actor behind things.
Mm-hmm.
And if there was any doubt, they shot him just so he could be clear about who really runs it.
Yeah. And the fact is,
keep him in check.
I love Ronald Reagan. He's a great guy. But quite honestly, I don't think he had the capacity, even prior to his mental issues. I don't think he had the capacity within him or the know-how to put together something like Iran-Contra.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, that's bullish.
That definitely takes somebody who has had that background in black
maybe something
works,
like
black
a
ops.
former CIA director.
Yeah,
there you go.
Precisely. Which utterly puts forth the point of deflection of, well, I don't recall.
Right.
I don't. It's perfect plausible deniability. You've set up for it, and the fact that is even not even possibly there, but like there. That's there.
Everything is there. The thing is that people don't want to look at it, and if they do look at it, they look away, immediately.
Yeah.
I mean, Ronald Reagan, he came up when Hollywood was a complete mob operation. He's part of the people who made their name because he was beholden to the mafia.
He was willing to name names.
Right. He was a spokesman for General Electric, I believe.
Yep.
Screenwriters
back in the 50s or something. Right. And all those people, they were picked by the mob. The Chicago mob controlled Hollywood for the beginning until it was taken over by the other mob,
Yeah.
The one that still owns it.
Well, and I would love to have you on talking about that at some point. But going into some of this with the current situation in America, I'd like to talk a little bit about number one, what you're looking at in parts 3 and 4 of Borderline. Where are we going in this story? Because we've of course heard what the Mexican side of things are, and really what a lot of the basis for the power vacuum, what allowed the cartels to come to power, what allowed Sinaloa to come to the power that they are, things like that, is there. But where are we going in parts 3 and 4 of this investigative journey?
Well, part 3 basically goes down the thread of if looking at the war on drugs as a policy, we go down the thread of the implementation of that policy over the last couple of decades and how that intertwines or dovetails rather with the trade regime, of which they're both two sides of the same coin, basically. And what the trade regime really is basically American corporations asserting their dominance in all foreign markets, as many as possible. The trade agreements that have been signed over the years, they're just it's kind of what they want to do is, again, it's about maintaining control over the knowledge. That's what it comes down to. And basically, in part 3, we go through all the policy implementation tactics and how they do it and when they did it, and how the Defense Department basically took over at some point. And now today they are the number one agency. Or department rather, that controls the interdiction of drugs and what have you.
Yeah, because after 9/11, it became a matter of national security.
Yeah.
Oh no, they did that in the Bush did that before 9/11.
Oh,
but
wow.
Yes,
Okay.
The securitization of as a matter of national security is a very important part of it.
Yeah.
And that's part 3 deals in the details of that, how they did it, how what they do as a result of that. What that means for the rest of the world, that it's a matter of U.S. national security. It has really nothing to do with the U.S.
No. And it's interesting how we as a country, especially with the reach of the UN, things like that, have actively reached into the politics of other countries, countries like the Netherlands, things like that, to try and enact our own drug policy upon other countries.
Yep. Yeah, no, I mean it's really hilarious that when you really you see it as it is, it's like, are you kidding? But
yeah, it's pretty laughable. But at the same time, horrifyingly laughable. The fact that we kind of expect these other countries to toe the line. It's a full-on expectation.
Well, it's they're holding a gun to their head. That's why the Defense Department is there to make sure that they do as they're told.
And
That's why we have 800 bases around the world.
Yeah, it was most definitely, I think, our first shot heard around the world as far as if you're not with us, you're against us.
Right.
When it came to the UN,
That famous freaking line.
because it came before 9/11, when George Bush, of course, said, if you harbor terrorism or terrorists, we're coming after you. And it was funny how we said the same thing about drugs years ago, yet still we are farther than elbow deep, if not torso deep, in the drug trade in this country.
Well, and the terrorism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I would love to have you on future episodes to talk about the full on U.S. funding of terrorism, the full on things like Benghazi, stuff like that. That were like, are you kidding me right now?
There's a Hollywood flick on that one.
That actively just happened.
You mentioned 9/11 in relation to the national security issues, but that's the point where the war on drugs meshed with the war on terror. So now it's all one big.
And that's just it. That was the beginning of really the third round of anti-drug propaganda in America. Of course, the first round was reefer madness, things like that. The second round was when I was a kid. This is your brain on drugs.
Just say no.
All that kind of just
Nancy
say
Reagan.
no. And in 2001, it begat the third wave, which was very much if you're smoking marijuana, you're supporting a terrorist organization. Terrorist organizations use marijuana to support their funding.
Well, I thought it's supported by the government. They must be the terrorists.
What it is, the reason they did that is because when you look at it, the war on drugs was essentially, it was part of a policy that's designed to act in the sphere of Latin America, whereas terrorism was designed to act in the sphere in other countries overseas. So what you have when you mesh those two things together, now you have a global security policy. Right?
Exactly. You've got a great global security policy because whenever you're talking about things like Asiatic countries, things like that, you get to hit both hammers. You get to hit the drug trade and Islam.
And now,
damn.
Coincidentally, now, historically, the last 40 years, the United States has been the largest market for illegal drugs in the world. But now, coincidentally, that ranking is now moving to Europe. Now Europe is becoming the number one drug market in the world, right? So that's very coincidental, very appropriate for their designs, right? Now the Zetas are selling drugs in Europe, not only in the United States.
Wow,
so it's all one big happy family now.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty impressive to hear, and I'd love to talk with you more about that in future episodes. I'm sure that it's stuff that you go into in parts 3 and 4 of Borderline, the unhinged truth about the drug war.
Yeah, I mean, not so much Europe, but I mean, in part 3 we go into the details of the policy. In part 4, essentially, I kind of bring it all back. I kind of finish the story that I started in part 1 in terms of what happened with all that, the end result of all that, and then what kind of I see for the future in terms of how they're moving forward with the new paradigm of the war on drugs and how that is going to play out, especially in Mexico with the new president coming in.
Yeah.
When I first wrote it, we kind of already knew he was going to be elected or put into power.
It was pretty well a lot.
Wait a minute, is he another PRI guy?
that's his origins are PR. He came from there.
Yeah.
He's been around forever. He's a dinosaur.
Yeah, well, and you were saying that before the show, that he's very much a dinosaur politically in Mexico. It's amazing how much press he's getting and everything else on other fronts.
You can tell that he was going to be elected because, if you read publications here like the CFR and the Washington Post, they're all praising him like he's the next Obama or something.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
The hype.
You can tell just by the line that's being told
the hype.
what's going to happen, and how to. Number one, how does your family feel in the current climate in Mexico, and how do you feel as someone living here?
Well, in practical terms, my mom's like, well, what do you have to put your name on the credits of the movie?
Yeah. Can't you use a nom de plume?
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not, that's neither here nor there anymore. It's just, But, as far as me personally, we live in a different time now. We live in a time where this is part of also like I have ulterior motives for making Borderline, which have nothing to do with the actual, plot of Borderline or anything. And it's basically this idea that we have these tools now as creators, as content creators. We have the ability to do our own research and to make these, productions. Just like yourself, you have your own, podcast company, and I have these skills that, my father was in advertising his whole life, but when computers came out, his whole, everybody he worked with, and including him included, they were out of work because, he didn't know how to use computer.
Yeah, the learning curve was too large.
Well, you had, in advertising, you had this guy called Pay Stuff. Yeah. And he was a guy who you put the letters together, in a publication, like manually. That work disappeared.
No, it's a typesetter.
Right.
That was an actual skill.
Right. There were many skills like that disappeared overnight. My father's was one of them.
Yeah.
And I came up, right when it was starting, when computers were coming up. I'm 43 years old, so it was, I started early, so I gathered all these skills, and I know how to do all these things. What? And so now, I think we're like at a bridge in history.
Okay.
And we're kind of like the people who cross this bridge, which are like people like you guys and me, who came from the old world, and are part of the new world, digitally speaking. We're the ones that are going to either carry forward or lose to the Instagram zombies that are on the other side, Yeah. We don't know anything.
Absolutely.
Zombies are winning right now.
Absolutely. And I mean, quite honestly, I'd have to ask you as a father-son question, as a man who has a 1-year-old son, and I'm doing the best I can to actively teach him cable connections and switches and buttons and make him interested in those things, even as a 1-year-old. And it's amazing the stuff he can do even as a 1-year-old. But societally, as a father, what was it with your father being involved in media and publication, things like that? What was it that drew you in that direction from that? Because I definitely, sure, I'd love nothing more than to one day just be behind a microphone and my son is the one running HC Universal Network. That would be great. But what was it that gave you that itch?
Well, I'll give you an answer based on the fact that I'm a very observational kind of person. That I kind of step back from things. I've always seen things from afar, even as a child. And what I can tell you is that you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is make sure that he's watching you. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, he's gonna do what he knows. We all do what we know. So, I wouldn't force anything on him.
Yeah.
He's gonna find his own way into whatever he's gonna do, and maybe what you do is just a bridge for him, or maybe he's gonna follow right through
to the next step, or whatever.
Well, and I think that's important. That's one reason why I have the Dads and Beer podcast is to talk about that kind of stuff. This concept of what we do pass along to the next generation. What knowledge do we share? What are we trying to carry forward? And you yourself, even with Deep City Chronicles, even with Borderline, even with your upcoming documentary, Ghost on the Water, it's the fact of, like I said before about Dudes and Beer, I had a burden of knowledge. There was just the fact of, like, I'm sorry, this is there. Mm-hmm. I don't care about any pundit's opinion or anything else.
Right.
Let's just strip it down to raw facts, and let's just start looking at unabridged facts. And when you start looking at unabridged facts from places, things get a little disturbing in the modern day.
And also that's a very, that's what I was talking about when I was saying that, we're kind of the bridge generation, so to speak, because all those things that we took, from the internet aren't there anymore. I just found a cache of documents that I downloaded between 1998 and 2003.
Wow.
Right? A bunch of stuff. Like back then I used to just go in and just like dive in and download everything I could.
I know. PDFs like crazy, man.
Yeah.
Before PDFs, before there was even the PDF, it was like...
No, I talk about it all the time when you used to have to dial into bulletin board systems, and if you didn't know how to change your text,
now
then
we're talking the 90s for sure.
The dude that ran the bulletin board didn't think you were legit, so you couldn't share certain types of files. And
all that stuff is gone now.
You're
all
that
those
fax dialing for the internet connection.
And I definitely say frequently on this show, we're today 1991, I would be I'm already on government watch lists, just from shows I've done, things like that. But I would definitely be on government watch lists.
Guilty by association.
Just by files I downloaded, things that I shared, stuff like that. I hope to God the registry doesn't go back that far.
The registry.
But good God, I mean, they got access to what I checked out at public libraries, Like, I'm not going to deny it.
I remember in the 90s was the Anarchist Cookbook, and there was, many of my friends had it.
That kind of stuff was everywhere.
Yeah,
good God.
It was everywhere.
There may be a copy kicking in my mother's garage. Don't go kick my mom's door down, government.
It's like the things that was already going on in there. It's like, now you're on the damn watch list,
Well, and that's just it. We've gotten to a place in our society where, it's become something more than see something, say something.
Right.
It's become this watchdog concept out of control.
Right. So we got that. We get that fear the government puts in.
Yeah. Go ahead, Raul.
No, what I'm saying is this kind of work, Borderline and Deep City and all that stuff is basically the fruition, in my case, of, all these years of doing research and reading and taking things that are, no longer like the internet has now become just like these centralized little clicks, Twitter and Facebook and what have you, YouTube. And all those things, all those, really important documents and research that was once online is no longer there.
Yeah.
And I think we have to kind of like parse that information and regurgitate it,
right?
And put it out there again in a form that is going to be harder to take down. What I mean? Like if more of us do it,
I won't deny the fact that on dudesandbeer.com, everybody, if you go and check out dudesandbeer.com/knowledge-vault, go check that out. That has tons of actual PDF documents of declassified government programs, things like Operation Northwoods, stuff like that.
I like the Tesla
UFO
stuff.
Documents, Tesla documents, all kinds of things, because like you said, it's become a place where that information is not readily available anymore.
But we need to make as members of, I'll call it the creative class, like this, one of these books over here. We have to refashion the information to feed it to the people. It's like that's kind of what I think we have to do.
We've got to make it palatable.
Yeah, we got to make these types of documentaries. We have to just deliver it in ways that they'll get it.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Well, and I think you couldn't have said it better, because quite literally it's the fact of you've got to take these outlying stories like this and really bring it into almost a local news personal aspect, where it's like, how does it affect somebody in your community?
Right.
You've got to personalize it. We talk about that on this show all the time. We talk, the fact of we have become anesthetized as a society. We no longer really care about what's happening to our direct neighbor, like the dude that shares a fence line.
Right.
Like just a few weeks ago, I went and shared some information with a couple of my neighbors that have small children that there was a coral snake sighting in my backyard.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Coral snakes are colorful. They're pretty. Kids want to play with them. You may want to let your kids know what one looks like. And it just kind of blew their mind that I was even coming to their house to begin with, without there being a problem,
without a problem,
and the fact that I was like, "Hey, you got kids." Like you may want to know what the snake. Yeah, like you may want to know what the most venomous snake in America looks like. I just saw one in my backyard, and I was not able to catch it and kill it.
What was the reaction besides like a shocked look?
It was a lot of it was quite honestly like, oh wow, like they didn't even know that was the most venomous snake in North America.
Right.
And I was like, check it out. Here's some stuff, and I printed things out in English and Spanish.
Oh, nice!
Because I live in a bilingual neighborhood, so it was like, here's some information on what a coral snake does and everything
you're the
else.
President of your block.
How to identify one. But just the concept of even going to my neighbor was so foreign.
Yeah,
that's a byproduct of the big data syndrome. It's like everything is just, it's living in a cloud somewhere. And I call it the age of ignorant erudition. Everybody thinks they know something because they can Wikipedia it or Google it, but they know nothing. It's like
I think that goes back on that thing y'all were talking about earlier. To me, is like the society and the education of society. And when I think of education, not so much of like, oh, do they know how to make wafers or something technological, but more so just the history, period.
Sure.
Do you know your history? I can tell people about Oliver North in the 80s and all that, and they don't know nothing about that. That's clueless to them.
Well, and there is definitely the fact of willful ignorance. And we suffer from that in this country horribly. People would just rather not know.
Yeah, they want to be entertained. They're waiting for Friday night. Get the paycheck, and that's it.
That's true.
How am I gonna get laid this Friday? That's all they're thinking about.
I'm gonna be honest, because I almost made the meme picture all of a few weeks ago, and I'm gonna say it here on the show just so if somebody makes it, it's known that they stole my idea. It's Donald Trump's head on Russell Crowe from Gladiator saying, "Are you not entertained?"
Yeah. That's a nice one. Yeah, I can see that.
It'll go right over their head.
Oh yeah, but it's absolutely true. Like, we have re-entered gladiatorial combat in America. Like, we just lived through our first reality TV election.
But even that, I mean, the fact that Donald Trump is the president of the United States.
Straight up. Straight up.
How entertaining is that, right?
That's mind numbing.
That gets you off of the facts.
We did an entire election
Society
episode,
is
Raul, where we covered the election live.
Yeah, we were there.
And man, I'm here to tell you, there was probably about a good 2 minutes of stunned silence that I did not edit out. Because everybody was like, there were people that left. They were like, I'm just leaving now.
Yeah, they did say that.
Like, I don't even know how to even deal with this. Yeah. And it was one of those, like, to see that.
And yet, you know he's there because they put him there.
Right. Yeah.
There's no way anybody elected that guy. It's like maybe 30,000 people in the whole country went and actually voted for him.
Sure.
But they put him there, and it's just mind-boggling that people. It's like 9/11 all over again.
Yeah, no, I said it on this show so many times. I wish it was the fact that we had transcripts that I could go search and post the episodes where it was like, this is the biggest rigged election that you'll ever see. This is the biggest point of prestidigitation, which is the art of finger manipulation, folks. It's the art of sleight of hand.
Magician.
Here you have a dude running for Republican office that has never once supported Republicans, never once given money to Republicans, never invited Republicans to weddings or been at Republicans' weddings.
Even told a few of them off while he was campaigning.
And yet still he managed to win not only the Republican candidacy, but win the election. And all of the other stuff at the same time with the rigging, the full-on rigging of the DNC primary just got swept to the wayside. And it was one of those like, wow, like either way you had the puppet in office. Yeah. That was beautifully orchestrated. Like, hats off to you. Yeah. I can't even deny the brilliance behind that.
It's just, I don't know. It's just if it's brilliance or if it's just an absolute indictment of our current era. Like, what the fuck? Like, who is manning the controls here? Like,
the complete absorption of Bernie Sanders into the Democratic Party from being an independent completely and utterly took away any hope. That would have been maybe the first time that we actively saw an independent viable for the White House. Had he not joined the Democratic Party.
Right. Yep. The best bet of an independent winning.
Like that was the last time.
Other than the Tea Party.
That was the last time since really Ross Perot. Right. That we saw an independent up on stage. Saying his piece, like you're talking about 20 years, folks, of straight up suppressing another party.
To me, it's no different than PRI. We got two of them. Yep. And they just got one. We just got one more to keep.
Absolutely. I've never been, growing up in Mexico, the political machinations and manipulations in Mexico are nowhere near as sophisticated as they are here. You can really see through it. Right. Yep. So when it's kind of like training with one of those big heavy balls in the gym. That's kind of like Mexico in politics. Like when you grow up with that and you come here, like you can see through everything here. It's like, really? Like there's no. I've never even had the pretension of believing that elections even matter. The only level that it actually does happen to a certain extent is very local. Yes. Municipal level politics.
Yeah, exactly. Local and state government. Mm-hmm. I rail on that on this show all the time.
You might be able to get something done.
If you actively want to make some change, folks, pay attention to your local and state. That's where it lies.
State is more difficult. But
a little bit.
Definitely.
Yeah. And, I can't thank you enough for coming on tonight, Raul. Sharing your vast pool of information and knowledge, not only in the realm of politics, but especially in the realm of drug trade, the financing of drug trade, the collapse of the economy of Mexico, things like that. Please do tell everybody where they can go to find your great work from Deep City Chronicles, as well as the awesome documentary, parts 1 and 2, parts 3 and 4 forthcoming.
Oh, I can't wait to see those.
Borderline, the unhinged truth about the drug war.
Well, first of all, thank you guys for having me.
Most definitely.
It's great.
Oh, yeah.
To do it with you guys. And yeah, I mean, as far as the documentary series, you guys, I mean, everybody can go to borderlinedocumentary.com, and it's all available there. Or you can find it through Pledge Pass. Well, you can buy your ticket. Just go to borderlinedocumentary.com.
Yeah.
You can see all the information there. As far as Deep City Chronicles, that right now is basically my personal blog at the moment. But I really want it to be a space where, independent journalists can go and use the platform eventually.
Absolutely.
So if anybody wants to, become a part of it, start posting there, just shoot me a line, editor@deepcitychronicles.com, or, contact me through Borderline. But I mean, I hope you guys can make Borderline watched by more people than it is currently being watched by.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, we're good about that.
We're all about sharing this kind of information, letting people know that this kind of stuff exists, that these documentaries are out there, that this kind of information is available.
Right.
Because it's obfuscated, folks, purposefully so.
Purposely, yeah.
These
Emphasis
things
on
are
that.
purposefully hidden from us. These government programs, things like Fast and Furious, stuff like that seem like a great idea on the surface, but in all actuality are nothing more than a means for us to finance these horrible actions on behalf of our government. And as a citizen, it's one of those things of like, I'm actively taking part in it.
Right, exactly.
To turn a blind eye means I am actively taking a part in it.
Yeah.
To
if you recognize it,
to
you turn a blind
disallow
eye.
this
Yeah,
information,
you disallowed.
to not accept this information,
Right.
to not look at it
Right.
in a factual light, to not look at the fact that the people that founded this country founded it on drug dealing.
What happened to them could happen to
The
you.
fact that we on a regular basis not only topple governments, but are willing to go to the means of assassination
Oh, yeah.
as a government to put in puppet regimes to assure that these things happen.
Mm-hmm.
To assure that governments are no longer what they once were.
Right.
And I can't thank you enough for coming on tonight and sharing the information that you've shared tonight, Raul. It's so entirely important. I'm so happy that you were willing to come on and share this stuff.
No, man, thank you. And thank you, Steven, as well.
Thank you, Raul.
Well, and
So,
once again, tell everybody where they can go to check out the work of Deep City Chronicles, as well as Borderline, the unhinged truth about the drug war.
well, for Borderline, just go to borderlinedocumentary.com. On deepcitychronicles.com, you'll find information about my next project, which is, in my estimation, even more important than this one, which is Ghost on the Water. And you can see that on the footer of Deep City Chronicles. Find that quickly.
And we'd love to have you on not only when that launches, but when the rest of Borderline comes out, as well as regular things happen within the news,
Right.
That people are just unaware of,
Right.
Things that are hugely impactful that just get
Well, you know what I wanted
softball toss.
On speaking of news, when you know the history of the beast, when you watch the news, you can see through the bullshit in a way.
You can.
Right.
Yeah,
right?
you can
Very
absolutely see the patterns that happen.
Right.
And that's truth, Stephen. On that note, everybody, please do make sure to go check out the work of DeepCityChronicles.com. Please do make sure to check out BorderlineDocumentary.com while you're online. Check out DudesandBeer.com. Download our app. Check us out on the HC Universal Network. Until next time, everybody, if you can't be good, be good at it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Dudes and Beer Podcast. To listen to our audio streams or chat with us live, download the official Dudes and Beer app for Android and iDevices, available on Google Play and iTunes markets. For more episodes, content, and information, visit us online at dudesandbeer.com. You can also find our episodes on Breach.tv, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast service. Dudes and Beer is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. For more about our sponsors and other podcasts on this network, visit hcuniversalnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, everybody, and until next time, drink responsibly.